I bought a new suitcase for that trip, the good kind with the wheels that don't wobble, because I was flying to see my daughter for the first time in 3 years, and I wanted to walk off that plane looking like a man who had his life together. I ironed a shirt I hadn't worn since Rosalind's funeral. I got to the gate 90 minutes early, the way I've gotten everywhere early since 1974, and I sat there rehearsing what I'd say when I saw her at baggage claim. But I never got the chance to say any of it, because the man holding a sign with my name on it wasn't my son-in-law. He was a process server, and the paper he handed me before I'd even set my suitcase down was a petition asking a judge in Sarasota County to declare me incompetent. I should tell you who I am first, because it matters more than anything else in this story. My name is Harlan Voss. I'm 71 years old, and for 31 years I was a claims investigator for a regional insurance carrier out of Toledo, Ohio, the kind of job where they hand you a file and a company car and tell you to find out whether somebody's telling the truth. I got good at it. I got so good at it that toward the end they had me training the younger investigators, teaching them the things you can't put in a manual, how a man's shoulders drop half an inch when he's about to lie to you, how a woman's story gets too smooth once she's rehearsed it, the difference between somebody who's grieving and somebody who's performing grief for a camera. I retired at 65 with a good pension and a plaque I keep in a box somewhere, and I want you to remember that plaque, because a man who spent 3 decades reading liars for a living is about to tell you how his own daughter fooled him completely. Her name is Marguerite. She's 42. She calls herself Margot, has since college, and I never could get used to it, so in my head she's still Marguerite, still 11 years old on a bicycle in our driveway in Perrysburg. She's a financial planner, has her own small practice, does very well for herself. 3 years ago, we had a falling out over her mother's estate. Rosalind died of a stroke, sudden, no warning, no will updated since 2009. And Marguerite thought I'd mishandled the probate. I thought I'd favored her brother Denny in some way. I never intended, and still don't fully understand. She stopped calling. I sent birthday cards that came back unopened twice. And then I stopped sending them because a man can only knock on a door so many times before he starts to feel like a fool for knocking. Then, 6 weeks ago, a text. First contact in 3 years. Dad, I've been thinking about you. Come stay with us for a week. I want to make things right. I read that message so many times the screen dimmed and lit up again in my hand a dozen times before I put the phone down. I want to be honest about something, and it's the only part of this story that still makes my face hot with shame. I have spent 31 years watching families destroy each other over money, over houses, over who called the ambulance and who didn't come to the hospital. I have sat across kitchen tables from grown children who were sweet as pie to an old parent's face and were already talking to a lawyer behind that same parent's back. I have seen the pattern so many times I could diagram it on a chalkboard. And when my own daughter sent me 11 words, I didn't apply a single thing I knew. Hope doesn't ask your permission. It just walks in and sits down at the table like it owns the place. I bought the suitcase. I bought a little stuffed manatee for my granddaughter Wren, who I'd never met in person, who was born the year Marguerite stopped speaking to me. I flew from Toledo to Tampa with a connection in Charlotte, and I sat by the window both legs and thought about what I'd say, and I landed at Tampa International at 4:20 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and I walked down to baggage claim with my heart going like a schoolboy's, and there was a man in a gray suit holding a piece of paper with my name printed on it in block letters, Harlan Voss. I actually smiled at him. I thought maybe Marguerite had sent a driver, maybe things had gotten fancy for her, and I walked right up and said, "That's me, proud as anything." He asked me to confirm my date of birth. Then he put an envelope in my hand and said, "Mr. Voss, you've been served," and turned and walked away before I even understood what those words meant applied to me instead of somebody in one of my own files. I stood in that baggage claim with families hugging and rolling suitcases past me on every side, and I opened the envelope right there because 31 years of training doesn't turn off just because your hands are shaking. Petition for determination of incapacity and appointment of guardian, filed in the 12th Judicial Circuit, Sarasota County, Florida. Petitioner, Marguerite Voss Halloran. My daughter's married name, which I'd had to learn from a Christmas card 3 years ago, because nobody told me she'd married. I read the first page standing up. I read it again, sitting down on a bench with my new suitcase between my knees, the manatee still in the outer pocket where I'd tucked it that morning in Ohio like it mattered. The petition said I suffered from progressive cognitive decline. It said I had recently made erratic and unexplained financial decisions. It said I posed a danger to myself living alone. It asked the court to appoint a guardian over my person and my property, and the name proposed for that guardian was not my daughter. It was a man named Corbin Ash, listed as a professional guardian with a firm called Century Family Fiduciary Services, and I had never in my life heard that name before I read it off that page in a Florida airport, with my hands not shaking anymore, gone very still instead. The way they used to get still right before I walked into an interview I already knew the answer to. I didn't call Marguerite. I want you to notice that, because it tells you something about what 31 years does to a man. My first instinct wasn't to call my daughter and demand an explanation. My first instinct was to find a quiet corner of that airport and read the document like a file. Because that's what it was, a file built against me, and I needed to know what was in it before I said one word to anybody in it. I found a bar near Gate 51, ordered a coffee I never drank, and read 12 pages twice. The petition cited 3 incidents. The first, I had allegedly tried to wire $18,000 to an unfamiliar account in April, described as consistent with elder financial scam victimization. The second, I had allegedly told a neighbor I didn't recognize my own house, described as consistent with disorientation and memory loss. The third, and this one I read 4 times because it didn't sound like anything that had ever happened to me at all. I had allegedly called 911 in June reporting an intruder, and police had found no evidence of forced entry, described as consistent with paranoid ideation. I don't own $18,000 in liquid funds I'd wire to a stranger, not without 3 signatures and a conversation with my own accountant first, because I spent 31 years teaching people not to do exactly that. I have lived in the same house on Birchwood Lane in Perrysburg since 1988, and I could walk it blindfolded. And I have never called the police in my life for an intruder, because the one time in 20 years I thought I heard something in the garage, it was a raccoon, and I handled it myself with a broom, and felt foolish enough about it that I never told a soul. None of it had happened. Not the wire transfer, not the confused neighbor conversation, not the 911 call. 3 incidents, cited with dates, described with clinical language borrowed straight out of an elder abuse pamphlet, and not one of them had ever occurred in my actual life. So I did the thing 31 years trained into me before I did anything else. I called my son. Denny is 38, an electrician, lives 40 minutes from me in Ohio, and Denny and I talk maybe twice a month, nothing fancy, just enough to know each other still upright. I told him where I was and what I was holding. There was a long quiet on that line, longer than a bad connection explains, and then Denny said, "Dad, did you know Margot's been calling me? Asking questions? About whether you've seemed off lately, forgetting things." I told her, "No, you're sharp as a tack. Why's she asking?" And I stood in that bar in Tampa International and understood that this hadn't started with a plane ticket. It had started weeks ago, quietly, with my own daughter laying groundwork with my own son, and Denny hadn't thought to mention it to me because it hadn't seemed like anything yet. I didn't rent a car and drive to her house. I want you to understand why, because everybody who's heard this story since asks me that first. It's because I know exactly what happens to a man who shows up angry at the address named in a guardianship petition. I have written the anger up myself, in other people's files 100 times. Agitated presentation at petitioner's residence. Confirms concerns regarding volatility. If I'd driven to that house and pounded on the door demanding answers, I would have handed them the best evidence they could have asked for, delivered by me, free of charge, with my own fists. So I booked a room at an airport hotel instead, and I called a number I'd gotten from an old colleague years before and never expected to need. An elder law attorney in Sarasota named Priscilla Odom, and I sat in that hotel room until nearly midnight with the petition spread out on the bed like a case file, because that's exactly what it was. Priscilla met me the next morning in an office, 2 blocks from the courthouse, 60-some years old herself, a woman who'd clearly heard every version of this story and was still angry about each one individually. She read the petition without expression. Then she said, "Mr. Voss, I want you to tell me about Corbin Ash. Do you know him?" I told her I'd never heard the name. She turned her laptop around. Corbin Ash had been appointed professional guardian in Sarasota and Manatee counties on 34 separate occasions in the past 6 years. 34 wards. She pulled up the public docket and let me read it myself. My own name now sitting on a list I'd have investigated for a living if I still had the job. He doesn't get appointed unless a family member petitions and a doctor signs off. Priscilla said. So somebody had to get a doctor to sign something. Has anyone examined you recently, Mr. Voss? A physician you don't remember consenting to? I hadn't seen a doctor in 8 months, not since a routine physical back in Ohio. I told her that, and she nodded slowly, the way you nod when a piece slides into a shape you already suspected. Then we need to find out whose signature is on that capacity evaluation, she said, because somebody signed one, and it wasn't done in a room with you in it. We got it 2 days later. A doctor, Selwyn Pruitt, board certified, practicing in Bradenton, had signed a capacity evaluation dated 3 weeks before that trip, stating he had examined me and found signs consistent with early-stage dementia. 3 weeks before that trip, I had been in Perrysburg, Ohio, 1,100 miles away, at my own kitchen table doing the crossword, and I had never met Dr. Selwyn Pruitt and never set foot in the state of Florida. I want to stop here, because if you're listening to this and you have a parent, or you are one, I need you to understand what almost happened to me, and I need you to understand how quiet it would have been. Nobody breaks the law loudly to do this. If a petition is filed and a physician's evaluation is attached, a judge can appoint an emergency temporary guardian within days, sometimes without the proposed ward ever appearing in court at all, because the ward is presumed too incapacitated to meaningfully participate in that first hearing. If I hadn't opened that envelope with a professional investigator's eye in an airport bar, if I'd panicked, called my daughter screaming, driven to that house and made a scene, I believe with my whole chest that within 2 weeks a stranger named Corbin Ash would have controlled my house, my pension, my bank accounts, and every decision about where I was allowed to live and who I was allowed to see. There would have been no handcuffs. There would have been a folder, a signature, and a very calm process server in an airport. Priscilla filed our response within the week, and she filed something else too, a formal demand for a second, independent capacity evaluation, and a demand for jury determination, which she told me almost nobody ever requests, because by the time a person is fighting a guardianship petition, they're usually too frightened and too poor to ask for the version that costs more and takes longer. Most people just want it over, she said. You don't strike me as most people. I told her to demand it. While we waited for a hearing date, I did what I should have done from that airport bench, and I called Marguerite directly, calm, recorded on my own phone with her knowledge, because Priscilla told me to, and I asked her one question: why? She didn't hang up. She didn't deny filing it. She said, in a voice I hadn't heard from her since she was maybe 19 years old, and defending some decision she already half regretted, "You don't know what you've been doing, Dad. I'm trying to protect you." And I asked her to name one thing, just one, that I had actually done. And there was a silence on that line long enough that I heard a television somewhere behind her, and then she said, "The house needs work you can't keep up with," which was not an answer to the question I'd asked. And we both knew it wasn't. Here's what I didn't understand yet, sitting in that hotel room turning the conversation over and over. I kept assuming this was about money, because money is what I'd have assumed in any of my own 31 years of files. Marguerite is a financial planner. She does well. She didn't need my modest pension or my paid-off house in Perrysburg, Ohio, worth maybe $200,000 on a good day. It didn't add up as greed, not the ordinary kind, and it nagged at me the whole week leading into that hearing, the way a case file nags at you when the obvious motive doesn't match the size of the effort somebody's put in. The hearing was set for a Tuesday in late July, 6 weeks after that airport bench, in a courtroom that smelled like every courtroom I'd ever sat in for 31 years, except this time I was the file. Priscilla warned me what to expect. They're going to make you answer questions that make you sound confused even when you're not, she said. It's not a fair fight, and it's not meant to be one. Just answer honestly and let me do the rest. Their attorney, a soft-spoken young man named Diedrich Prine, was gentle with me on the stand in exactly the way that scares me more than shouting ever could. "What's today's date, Mr. Voss? Who's the current president, Mr. Voss? Can you tell the jury the name of the street you grew up on?" I answered every question correctly, and he nodded pleasantly after each one like a man checking boxes, and then he asked me to recall the specifics of the alleged 911 call in June, the one I'd never made, and I said plainly that no such call had ever happened, and he said, gently, "Isn't it possible you simply don't remember making it, Mr. Voss?" And I understood, sitting there, that in that room my clearest denial and my worst confusion would look exactly the same to 12 strangers who had never met me before that morning. Then Priscilla stood up, and she didn't call me again. She called a records custodian from the Perrysburg Police Department, who confirmed under oath that no 911 call had ever originated from my address, not in June, not ever. Not once in the 11 years electronic dispatch records existed for that house. She called a manager from my bank in Toledo, who confirmed that no wire transfer request of any kind had been initiated on my account in April, that the account had shown no unusual activity of any kind in 14 months. And then she put Dr. Selwyn Pruitt's capacity evaluation on the screen beside a printout of my own debit card transactions from the date it claimed I'd been examined in his Bradenton office. Transactions showing a gas station and a grocery store in Perrysburg, Ohio, 1,100 miles from where the good doctor swore I'd been sitting across from him. Dr. Pruitt did not appear to testify. His attorney submitted a filing on his behalf stating he would assert his right against self-incrimination if called, which Priscilla told me afterward is about as close to a written confession as the law generally allows a man to get without actually saying the words. And then Priscilla called Denny. I hadn't expected that, and I don't think Marguerite had either, because I watched her face when Priscilla said his name, and something in it went the color of old paper. Denny took the stand in a shirt he'd clearly bought for the occasion, and Priscilla was patient with him the way you're patient with someone you know is about to say something that costs them. She asked him about a phone call from his sister in the spring, and Denny said Marguerite had called him twice, weeks apart, asking careful questions about our father, whether he'd seemed forgetful, whether he still managed his own bills, whether he'd said anything strange lately, and Denny had told her no both times. And the second time he'd asked her outright why she was asking, and she'd told him she was just checking in. Did she mention a guardianship petition? Priscilla asked. No, Denny said. Did she mention Corbin Ash or Century Family Fiduciary Services? No. Did she ever tell you our father would be served with legal papers in an airport? Denny's jaw worked for a second, before he answered. No. I found out from Dad, standing in a bar. He called me shaking. Then Priscilla asked the question that broke the room open, and it wasn't about money at all, and I hadn't seen it coming even after 31 years of seeing things coming for a living. Mr. Voss, she said, meaning Denny, are you aware that your father's estate plan currently names you as sole executor and divides the estate equally between you and your sister? Denny said yes. Were you aware there was ever a prior version of that document? And Denny, looking somewhere past his sister and not quite at her, said that 2 years ago Marguerite had asked him whether he'd ever seen an older will, one from before their mother died, one that supposedly left the Perrysburg house solely to Marguerite in recognition of years she'd spent nearby helping with their aging parents before the falling out, a document Denny had never seen and didn't believe existed, and that when he'd told her he'd never heard of it, she'd said maybe she was wrong, and dropped it, and he hadn't thought about it again until this week. I sat at that table and did the arithmetic I hadn't been able to do in 6 weeks of turning it over in that hotel room. Marguerite hadn't come looking for a guardian to control an $18,000 wire transfer that never happened. She'd come looking for a guardian who would answer to nobody but the court, a professional stranger who could be persuaded, quietly, informally, over months, to discover an estate planning irregularity and correct my will in probate on my behalf before I ever died, replacing an equal split with something closer to what she believed she'd been owed since her mother's funeral. It wasn't about my house or my pension today. It was about making sure that when I did die, the paperwork said something different than it currently says. And the only way to change what a living man's will says without his knowledge or consent is to first convince a court that the living man's knowledge and consent no longer count for anything. Priscilla let that sit in the room for a long moment before she asked her last question. And she asked it gently, the way you'd ask a hard thing of someone you didn't actually enjoy hurting. Mrs. Voss Halloran, she said, turning to my daughter, isn't it true that you've never once, in this entire process, actually spoken to your father about the house, or the will, or any of this, before filing a petition asking a court to take away his right to speak for himself? Marguerite didn't answer for 11 seconds. I counted them, the way I've counted silences in 100 interview rooms, because a silence that long always means the truth is arriving and the person knows it and is trying to find a door that isn't there. Then she said, very quietly, I didn't think he'd listen, and something in her voice cracked on the word listen that I hadn't heard since she was small. And for one terrible second, I wasn't looking at a woman who'd tried to have me declared incompetent. I was looking at my daughter, 11 years old, certain nobody in the house was hearing a word she said. The jury was out 35 minutes. They found me fully capable, no impairment, sound mind, sound judgment, every word of it read out by a foreman who wouldn't quite meet my eye, the way people do when they've just watched something in a family they wish they hadn't seen. The judge dismissed the petition with prejudice, ordered a referral of Dr. Selwyn Pruitt's license to the state medical board, and asked, almost as an aside to his clerk, whether anyone had looked into how many other capacity evaluations Dr. Pruitt had signed for petitions involving Corbin Ash as proposed guardian in the past several years. Nobody in that courtroom had an answer yet. Priscilla told me 2 months later that the state had opened an inquiry, and that Corbin Ash's guardianship appointments were now under review in 2 counties, and that I was not, as it turned out, the only person that particular doctor had certified without ever laying eyes on. Marguerite was not criminally charged. Filing a guardianship petition that fails isn't a crime by itself, even a bad faith one, which Priscilla told me is the part that keeps her up some nights after 22 years in this work. But the court did something I hadn't expected and still think about. It ordered that any future petition regarding my capacity, from any party, would require a court-appointed independent evaluator with no prior connection to either side, filed on the public record, with notice served to me directly, and not through any third party, meaning nobody could ever again file quietly and count on catching me by surprise in an airport with a folded piece of paper. I flew home to Ohio without ever seeing Wren, my granddaughter, that trip. The manatee is still in a drawer in my hallway closet, tags still on it. I think about giving it to her someday, and I don't know when someday is, and I'm not going to pretend to you that I've forgiven Marguerite, because 6 months isn't enough time, and any man who tells you it is has probably stopped feeling the thing he's talking about. But I called Denny more than twice a month now, and in October, a letter came from Marguerite, 4 pages, no lawyer's language in it anywhere, and I read it twice and haven't answered it yet, and I keep it in the same drawer as the manatee, which feels about right. 2 things I'm not ready for sitting side by side, waiting. Here's what 31 years of doing this for other people never taught me, and 1 bad week doing it for myself finally did. They don't come for your money first. They come for whether anybody has to believe you anymore. Because once a court decides your word doesn't count, your money is just a formality, and so is your house, and so is who's allowed to sit across your kitchen table and tell you what's best for you. And the ugly truth nobody in my old office ever said out loud is that most of the time, the people trying to take that from you aren't strangers at all. They're the ones you'd have handed it to willingly, if they'd only asked. So here's what I'd ask of you tonight, whoever's listening, wherever you are. Find out who's named on your power of attorney, and when you signed it, and whether you'd sign it again today if somebody handed it to you fresh. Find out whether your will says what you think it says, and when you last actually looked at it instead of just remembering the year you wrote it. And if you have a child you haven't spoken to in a while, and there's a version of this story where the silence gets used against you before the love ever gets the chance to come back. Don't wait for the dinner invitation to find out which one it's going to be. Tell me something before you go. Comment 1 if you think I was right to sit in that courtroom and let my own daughter answer for what she did instead of walking out before the verdict came in. Comment 2 if you think a father's love should have made me drop it the moment she cried. And comment 3 if, like me, your real mistake happened years earlier than the day everything came apart, some paper you signed, some conversation you let slide, some silence you let sit too long because you told yourself there'd be time to fix it later. Tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Because somewhere out there it's already tomorrow, and somewhere it's still yesterday, and I like knowing this story is sitting with you in both. Take care of yourself tonight, and go find out what you signed.